I thought he was gone forever." An officer cries when he finds his starving police dog. He hadn't seen his partner in over a year. Officer James had accepted the painful truth. His K9 dog, Shadow, was gone. Lost during a deadly warehouse explosion that left James in a wheelchair and Shadow missing without a trace. He had searched for months. Every shelter, every back alley, every abandoned building. But he found nothing. Everyone told him to move on. Everyone said the dog couldn't have survived. Then, on a rainy afternoon, while being pushed in his wheelchair past a bus stop, he froze. A starving German shepherd, mud-soaked, trembling and barely able to lift his head, sat curled against the glass. James whispered one name that shattered him completely. "Shadow?" The dog slowly lifted his head at the sound of James's voice. What happens next shocks everyone. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe. And really, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. Officer James Carter had earned many titles during his years in the police force. Sharpshooter, field trainer, tactical lead. But none of them meant as much to him as the one stitched quietly above his badge. K9, handler. It wasn't just a rank, it was a responsibility, a partnership, a promise. And that promise had been sealed the day he met a young German shepherd with restless eyes and a streak of fierce loyalty already burning inside him. Shadow wasn't like the other K9 recruits. He was faster, sharper, and strangely intuitive, as if he understood words before they were spoken. While other dogs relied on commands, Shadow relied on connection. And James, he was the only handler Shadow ever accepted. The bond formed instantly, surprising even the trainers who had seen hundreds of pairings before. From the very first day, James knew Shadow was different. Their training sessions became legendary at the academy. Shadow mastered obstacle courses in half the time. He memorized scent trails within minutes. He could detect hidden threats long before any human eye could see them. But what truly separated him from the rest was the way he moved beside James. Always matching his pace, always watching his face, always listening for the smallest shift in the tone of his voice. On duty, they were unstoppable. They tracked missing children through dense woods. They uncovered illegal weapons hidden beneath floorboards. They arrested violent offenders who thought outrunning a K9 was easy, until Shadow appeared, silent and swift like his name. Every successful mission strengthened their partnership. Every close call strengthened their trust. And every moment off duty, late-night walks, quiet car rides, simple moments of rest, strengthened their bond. James didn't see Shadow as a police tool. Shadow wasn't an asset. He was family. Many officers worked with K9s, but what James and Shadow had was rare, something the entire department noticed. They had a rhythm, a language without words. When James tensed, Shadow stood alert. When Shadow growled softly, James knew danger was near. And when James laughed, Shadow wagged his tail with pride, as if reminding everyone he was the reason James could smile even after the hardest days. Shadow wasn't just a partner. He was James's heartbeat in another body. And for a man who had lost more than he ever spoke about, friends, relationships, pieces of himself that duty demanded, Shadow filled the quiet spaces with loyalty no human had ever matched. No one could have imagined that this perfect partnership, this unbreakable bond forged in sweat and danger, would soon face the greatest test of all, a test that would tear their lives apart, a test neither of them deserved. It happened on a night that began like any other, quiet, cold, and strangely heavy, as if the air itself was warning them. Officer James, Carter, and Shadow were dispatched to an abandoned warehouse on the industrial edge of the city. A call had come in about suspicious activity. Lights flickering, shadows moving, strange noises echoing through the empty district. Most officers brushed it off as teenagers or squatters, but James felt something different. And Shadow, Shadow was restless from the moment they stepped out of the patrol car. The warehouse loomed before them, tall, rusted, and eerily silent. Rain tapped against the broken glass windows, creating a soft but unsettling rhythm. James tightened his grip on Shadow's harness. "Stay close," he whispered. Shadow responded with a quiet grunt, muscles tense, nose twitching rapidly in the damp air. Inside, the smell hit them first, chemical, bitter, wrong. Shadow's ears shot up instantly. He pulled forward, guiding James through the darkness with sharp, precise steps. Every few seconds he stopped, sniffed, and growled low, signaling danger. They found the source in the far corner, a makeshift lab filled with volatile chemicals, wiring, and crude explosives. A small team of criminals were inside, 3 men, startled when Shadow lunged into the room with a thunderous bark. Chaos erupted instantly. One of the suspects ran, another reached for a weapon. The third grabbed a detonator. James fired a warning shot. Shadow leapt forward, pinning the armed suspect to the ground with the strength of a trained warrior. But in that split second, the man holding the detonator smirked, a sick, triumphant expression that made James's blood run cold. "Shadow, move," James shouted, but it was too late. A violent blast ripped through the warehouse, a flash of blinding orange swallowing everything in its path. The force knocked James backward, sending him crashing through debris, his ears ringing, his vision spinning. The world dissolved into fire, smoke, and a deafening roar. James tried to stand but felt nothing. His legs numb, trapped under fallen metal beams. Dust clogged his lungs as he shouted Shadow's name through the haze. "Shadow! Shadow!" A faint bark answered him, weak, strained, heartbreaking. Through the smoke, James saw a silhouette, Shadow pushing himself up, limping toward him. But before he could reach James, another section of the ceiling collapsed, blocking the dog from view. And then, silence. When rescue teams arrived, they pulled James out barely conscious. They searched for Shadow but found only scorched rubble. Everyone told him the same words. No dog could survive that. But James never stopped hearing that final bark, Shadow's desperate attempt to reach him, a sound that would haunt him forever. The doctors told James he was lucky to be alive. Lucky? He hated that word. When he opened his eyes in the hospital, everything felt wrong. The room was too quiet. His chest felt too heavy. And when he tried to move his legs, nothing happened. Panic surged through him, but it was nothing compared to the pain that struck when he asked the only question that mattered. "Where's Shadow?" No one answered right away. The silence told him everything. By the time the police chief finally stepped in, his voice was gentle, almost fragile. "James, the explosion was too powerful. We searched, but nothing survived in that section." James stared at the ceiling, his throat tight, refusing to let the tears fall. Shadow wasn't just a K-9 unit partner. He was his anchor, his reason to fight, his heartbeat that kept James steady through his darkest moments. And now, gone, buried somewhere beneath twisted steel and flame. The following weeks blurred into one long stretch of pain, medication, and empty staring. Physical therapists tried to push him. Doctors encouraged him. Fellow officers visited, leaving flowers, cards, medals, even Shadow's service plaque. But the moment they placed the plaque in his lap, James gently closed the door and never opened it for visitors again. He blamed himself. He should have seen the trap. He should have protected Shadow. He should have taken the blast instead. The guilt carved into him like a knife that never stopped twisting. When he was finally discharged, the world outside felt colder, louder, and unbearably hollow. He traded patrol boots for a wheelchair, exchanged adrenaline for silence, and swapped the life he once knew for 4 walls and memories that broke him a little more each day. His apartment, once filled with Shadow's presence, the sound of paws pacing, the soft thump of a tail against the floor, was now suffocatingly quiet. The empty food bowl stayed in the corner. The leash remained hanging by the door. James couldn't bring himself to touch them. Sometimes at night he swore he heard shadows bark echoing faintly in the distance. He knew it wasn't real, but he listened anyway. The department offered him a new K-9 partner, a chance to return to modified duty, but James refused. No dog could replace the one who saved his life by giving up his own. Slowly, his days became predictable. Therapy sessions, doctor appointments, quiet afternoons by the window. The world moved on. The department moved on. But James remained stuck in the same moment, trapped beneath the rubble of that warehouse, calling out for shadow, waiting for a bark that never came. He didn't know it yet, but fate had not closed their story. It was only waiting. 12 months passed, but to James it felt like time had folded in on itself. Every day was the same. Quiet mornings, slow therapy sessions, afternoons spent staring through the window as life moved past him like a movie he no longer belonged in. The seasons changed, the city changed, but inside James, nothing changed at all. David, his closest friend and former partner on patrol, was one of the few people who still checked on him regularly. He visited every Sunday, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes bringing stories from the precinct, sometimes bringing nothing but his own quiet company. James appreciated it, even if he rarely said so. "Come on," David urged one rainy afternoon. "Your doctor wants a follow-up. I'll drive. You need the fresh air." James didn't argue. He didn't have the energy to. He simply nodded and allowed himself to be wheeled out, rain tapping softly against the hood of his jacket. The sky was a dull gray blanket, heavy and low. Water streamed down the sidewalks, pooling in shallow grooves, reflecting the blurred city lights. As David rolled the wheelchair toward the clinic, James felt an odd pressure in his chest, a heaviness that wasn't physical. Something about the weather, the stillness, the cold breeze brushing against his face. It tugged at him, whispering like a memory he couldn't place. "You're quiet today," David muttered behind him. "I'm always quiet," James replied with a faint, humorless smile. "No, this is different." James didn't respond. He didn't know how to explain the feeling twisting inside him. It wasn't sadness. He lived with that. It wasn't guilt. He carried that every day. This was something else. Something alive. Something pulling him. As they turned the corner near the bus stop, a sudden shiver ran through him. His hand gripped the armrest, not from fear, but from recognition. Recognition of what, he didn't know yet. The rain grew heavier, pounding against the metal frame of the shelter ahead. James saw a shape through the blurry glass. A curled silhouette, dark fur, motionless. For a moment he thought his mind was playing tricks on him again. Another imagined glimpse of shadow, another ghost his heart conjured in quiet moments. But this time, it didn't fade. His pulse quickened, his breathing slowed. The world narrowed to that one small shape sitting alone in the rain. "David," he whispered, barely audible. "Yeah?" "Stop." David froze. "What's wrong?" James didn't blink. Couldn't blink. The feeling inside him sharpened into something undeniable. Something real. I know that shape." Cold rain dripped from the bus shelter roof, trickling down the glass. And as the outline shifted slightly, lifting its head just an inch, James felt his entire world tilt. Someone, was waiting there. Someone he thought he'd lost forever. David slowed the wheelchair, his brows tightening with concern. "James, what are you looking at?" he asked, following his friend's frozen stare toward the bus shelter. But James couldn't speak. His breath hitched in his chest as the blurry shape inside the shelter shifted again. Slow, weak, almost collapsing. Through the streaks of rain sliding down the fogged glass, he saw a pair of thin legs curled beneath a frail body. Wet fur clung tightly to protruding bones. The dog was dripping, shivering, barely upright. Something about that posture, that tilt of the head, that defeated stillness. It stabbed James right in the center of his chest. David leaned closer. "It's just a stray, man. Come on, we're going to be late." "No," James whispered, "not a stray." His voice cracked. The dog slowly lifted its head at the sound. Only half an eye was visible through the smudged glass, but it was enough. A glint of gold. A familiar spark fighting through exhaustion. James felt the world collapse inward. He had seen that exact look 1,000 times. During training, during rescues, during late-night patrols when Shadow would glance up at him with quiet assurance. "Stop," James breathed. "Please, stop." David immediately halted the wheelchair. James pushed himself forward, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He couldn't move fast, couldn't stand, couldn't run the way he once did, but every inch of his body leaned toward the shelter as if pulled by a force stronger than gravity. Rain hammered against the pavement. Cars splashed through, puddles. People hurried by, paying no attention to the dying dog alone in the cold. But James couldn't look away. "James." "Hey," David said softly. "You're shaking." "That's—" His voice cracked again. "That's his shape, his head, his ears, even the way he curls when he's cold. I remember everything, every detail." David swallowed hard, glancing again at the dog. "It's been a year. It can't be." The dog lifted its head higher now, struggling, wobbling. For a moment it stared directly toward them through the rain-soaked glass. Then its tail, thin, frail, barely moving, gave a small, trembling wag. It wasn't joy, it wasn't excitement, it was recognition. James felt tears burning his eyes. "David," he whispered, voice breaking into pieces, "that's Shadow." Before David could respond, the dog tried to stand, but its legs buckled. It collapsed into the corner, gasping from weakness. James reached out instinctively even though Shadow was still meters away. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm right here, boy." The dog's ears twitched, and James knew, deep in the part of his heart that had never healed, that this moment wasn't a dream or a hallucination. It was real. The dog he mourned, the partner he buried in his mind, the friend he lost in the fire, was sitting broken and starving before his eyes. James couldn't breathe. His trembling fingers hovered in the air as David pushed the wheelchair closer to the shelter. Each inch felt like a mile. The sound of rain faded. The passing cars faded. Even David's voice drifted away until nothing existed except that broken, shivering dog curled against the cold glass. When they stopped in front of the shelter, James leaned forward, eyes locked on the animal inside. Up close, the sight was far worse. The dog's ribs pressed sharply against its skin. His fur, once thick and shiny, was clumped with mud, ash, and rain. His paws were cracked. His tail barely moved, shaking weakly with every exhale. But the eyes, those eyes, they were the same. Golden, intelligent, carrying a depth that no ordinary dog possessed. James's throat tightened. Shadow. He whispered, voice fragile as glass. The dog lifted his head, slowly, painfully, as if the simple act required every bit of strength he had left. The moment their eyes met, something inside James shattered. It wasn't just recognition, it was memory. Every mission, every bark, every shared heartbeat flooding back into him all at once. Shadow blinked weakly, then tried to stand. His legs trembled violently, unable to support his body. He collapsed again, letting out a soft, broken whine that stabbed James deeper than any injury he had ever felt. David knelt beside the shelter, his voice hushed. "James, this is impossible. The explosion—" "I know my dog," James whispered. "Even if the world didn't believe he survived, even if I didn't believe—" He wiped his eyes with a shaking hand. "I know my boy." Shadow dragged himself forward inch by inch until his nose touched the glass. He pressed it gently, as if trying to reach James despite the barrier between them. James leaned in, resting his forehead against the cold surface. "I'm here," he breathed. "I'm here, Shadow. I'm so sorry. I should have found you. I should have—" Shadow's paw lifted, trembling, and rested against the glass. A weak gesture. A desperate one. A familiar one. James remembered that gesture from their training days. Shadow's way of saying, "I'm okay." "Are you?" James burst into tears. David's voice cracked. "We need to get him help. Right now." James nodded, wiping his face. "Open the door." David hesitated. "James, he's severely hurt. He may be scared." "Shadow would never hurt me," James said softly. "Not even now." David opened the shelter door. Shadow, hearing the creak, lifted his head again. When James whispered his name one more time, gentle, broken, full of love, Shadow crawled forward, and with the last bit of strength inside his frail body, he placed his head in James's lap. Shadow's head lay in James's lap, light, trembling, and frighteningly fragile. James gently cupped the dog's face, feeling the sharp edges of bone beneath thin, matted fur. Shadow's breath came in shallow bursts, each exhale warmer than the cold rain falling around them. His once strong body now felt weightless, as if the wind could carry him away. James stroked his cheek with trembling fingers. "What happened to you, boy?" David knelt beside him, eyes widening in horror. "James, look at his side." James hesitated, then carefully lifted the soaked fur across Shadow's ribcage. His breath stopped. There, etched across Shadow's flank, was a series of scars, deep, jagged lines running diagonally, still pink around the edges. Not new wounds, old ones forged in fire, heat, and collapsing debris, the exact kind of wounds a dog would get from surviving an explosion. James's voice broke. These are from the warehouse." Memories flashed, flames roaring, metal crashing, Shadow barking desperately through the smoke. David swallowed hard. How did he even make it out? That place burned for hours. James didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he gently lifted Shadow's paw. Another shock hit him, the training band still wrapped loosely around it. The small metal tag, dented and blackened from heat, bore a single scratched word. K9. Shadow. The tag had somehow survived the blast, just like its owner. James pressed it to his forehead, tears mixing with rain. "You held on to this all this time." His voice cracked. "You were trying to come home?" Shadow whimpered softly, leaning into his touch. Then James noticed something else. Shadow's left ear had a familiar notch, the small crescent-shaped mark from a playful accident years ago. Every detail, every scar, every memory matched. This wasn't a stray. This wasn't a look-alike. This was Shadow, his Shadow. A dog the world had declared dead. David exhaled shakily. "James, there's no doubt, it really is him." But the joy of finding his partner was overshadowed by the horrifying reality of his condition. Shadow's breathing grew more ragged. His body sagged heavily against James, as if he had been holding himself together for months just to reach this moment. "We need to move," David urged. "He won't last long like this." James wiped his eyes, his voice firm despite the tremor. "Shadow survived hell to find me. I'm not losing him again." He slid his hands beneath Shadow's weakened body, lifting him as carefully as his broken heart allowed. Shadow didn't resist. He simply closed his eyes, trusting James completely. Just as he always had. Rain poured harder as James cradled Shadow in his arms, the dog's frail body barely warm against his chest. Shadow let out a weak whimper, so soft it was almost swallowed by the storm. But to James, it was louder than any siren. It was a plea, a warning, a cry for help. David opened the car door as fast as he could. "Get him inside," he urged, voice shaking. "We don't have much time." James nodded, though fear had locked his throat. He lifted Shadow carefully, feeling every bone, every tremor, every struggling breath. When he settled Shadow onto the back seat, the dog curled slightly, resting his head on James's lap as if afraid to lose him again. David sped onto the road, tires splashing through deep puddles. "I'm calling the emergency vet now," he said, fumbling for his phone. "Tell me the address. Tell me someone's there. Just tell me he'll make it." But James barely heard him. All he could focus on was Shadow's chest, rising too slowly, falling too weakly. Each breath sounded like a battle. James stroked, his muzzle gently. "Stay with me, boy. Stay with me. You fought the fire. You fought the streets. You can fight this, too." Shadow's eyes fluttered open for a moment. Golden, soft, tired. He looked up at James with something that felt like apology, as if he knew James had spent a year grieving, and he hated being the reason for it. James bent forward until his forehead rested lightly against Shadow's. "Don't you dare leave me again," he whispered. "Not now. Not like this." The car swerved around a corner. David muttered a curse under his breath. "Hold on, Shadow. We're almost there." But almost felt miles away. James checked Shadow's breathing again. It was getting weaker. His body felt too cold. His paws twitched uncontrollably, a sign of deep exhaustion. Or worse. Panic surged through James like electricity. "David, faster," he shouted. "I'm going as fast as I can." Red lights blurred past them. Horns blared. Rain hammered on the windshield like 1,000 frantic fingers. The world rushed by in streaks of color, but for James, everything moved in slow motion, the kind of slow motion that only happens when you're witnessing the worst moment of your life unfolding again. Shadow suddenly stiffened. James's heart dropped. "Shadow! Shadow!" The dog let out a sharp, painful gasp, then went limp for a second before breathing again. Barely. James clutched him tighter. "No, no, stay with me." David's voice broke as he shouted, "We're here!" He slammed the car to a stop in front of the emergency vet clinic. James didn't wait. He lifted Shadow into his arms again, rain soaking them both, and whispered one final plea as the clinic doors burst open. "Shadow, don't leave me. Not again." The clinic doors flew open as 2 veterinary technicians rushed toward James, lifting Shadow carefully onto a stretcher. His limp body jostled slightly, and Shadow let out a faint whine, so weak it nearly broke James in half. "Room 3, now!" one of the techs shouted. James tried to wheel himself forward, but David gripped the handles of his wheelchair, pushing quickly behind the medical team. The hallway lights blurred overhead, everything happening too fast and not fast enough all at once. When they reached the exam room, a tall, steady-voiced veterinarian stepped in. "What happened?" she asked urgently. James swallowed hard. "Found him on the street, starving, hurt. He's my K9 partner. He was in an explosion a year ago." The vet's eyes flicked to Shadow's injuries. "Get him on oxygen. Start fluids immediately. I need full vitals now." The room buzzed with controlled chaos. Machines beeping, gloves snapping, orders firing. James watched helplessly. Shadow's chest rose unevenly beneath the oxygen mask. His paws twitched. His heartbeat was faint, an irregular flutter barely strong enough to echo on the monitor. David placed a steadying hand on James's shoulder. "He's in the best hands now." But James felt cold, hollow, terrified. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity before the vet finally approached them, peeling off her gloves. Her expression was serious. Too serious. "Officer Carter," she began softly, "I need to be honest with you." James braced himself. "Tell me everything." She took a slow breath. "Your dog, he's been through a level of trauma that's almost impossible to survive." James's heart clenched. "He has old burn scars across his flank," she continued, "injuries consistent with high-impact debris, and he has fractures that healed incorrectly, meaning he didn't receive medical care after the explosion." James closed his eyes, pain slicing through him. Shadow had been out there suffering, alone. "But that's not all," the vet added. "Based on his condition, he's been wandering for months, barely eating, searching for something." She hesitated. Or someone. James's breath hitched. A tear slipped down his cheek. "He survived on instinct," she said gently. "But instinct alone wouldn't have kept him going this long. Something kept him moving. Dogs don't travel far unless they're looking for home." James lowered his head. "He was looking for me." The vet nodded. "That's what it looks like." A trembling sob escaped him. Shadow had crossed a year of pain, hunger, and darkness, just to find the only person he trusted. "But I won't lie," the vet continued. "He's critical. He's dehydrated, malnourished, and his organs are under strain. It's a miracle he's still breathing." James looked up sharply. "Can he survive?" The vet paused, a long, heavy pause. "We're going to fight for him," she said, "but it's out of our hands now. Tonight, we'll decide everything." James felt the floor tilt beneath him. Shadow was alive, but he was slipping away again. This time, James refused to lose him. Night settled over the emergency clinic like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The storm outside had quieted, but inside room 3, the storm had only begun. Machines beeped in uneven rhythms. Shadows flickered against the walls, and James sat beside Shadow's table, refusing to close his eyes, refusing to move, refusing to breathe without listening for Shadow's next breath. Shadow lay wrapped in warm blankets, an IV line taped gently to his trembling paw. His chest rose and fell in fragile, uneven motions. Each breath looked like a battle he wasn't sure he could win. James reached out, brushing a hand over Shadow's head. "You're not alone anymore," he whispered. "I'm right here." Shadow didn't open his eyes, but his ear twitched slightly, just enough for James to feel hope scrape through the darkness. David returned with 2 cups of coffee, setting one quietly next to James. "You should drink something," he murmured. "You haven't eaten all day." "I'm not leaving him," James said. "Not again." David lowered himself into the chair beside him, sighing. "I know, I won't either." Hours crawled by, each minute heavier than the last. Nurses entered, checked Shadow's vitals, adjusted fluids, whispered updates that did little to ease the terror twisting inside James. Every time the heart monitor slowed, James's breath caught. Every time Shadow's paw twitched, he leaned closer, desperate for any sign of strength. At one point, a nurse hesitated at the door. "He's very weak," she said gently. "You should prepare yourself. This may be his last night." James lifted his head sharply, his voice raw. "No, don't say that. He survived worse." She nodded sympathetically and left. But James's shoulders shook. He placed both hands on Shadow's head, his tears quietly soaking the fur he once groomed with pride. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have found you. I should have kept looking. You didn't deserve to face that fire alone, or wander the streets alone. But I'm here now, and I'm not losing you. Not tonight." The clock on the wall ticked into early dawn. David eventually drifted into a light sleep, but James stayed awake, staring at Shadow through burning eyes. Then, at the quietest moment of the night, Shadow moved, just a small shift of his head, barely noticeable, but to James it was everything. Shadow's golden eyes cracked open, unfocused but searching for the face he knew, the face he had walked a year to find. James leaned forward, voice trembling. "Shadow, I'm here, boy." Shadow inhaled, slow, shaky but purposeful. It was the first sign of fight James had seen. and in that tiny breath, hope returned. The first rays of dawn slipped through the clinic windows, casting pale streaks of gold across the room. James hadn't slept, not even for a second. His entire world was the rhythmic beeping of Shadow's heart monitor and the fragile rise and fall of his partner's chest. David rubbed his eyes, waking from a shallow sleep. "Any change?" he whispered. James shook his head, then suddenly froze. Shadow's paw twitched. The movement was slight, almost invisible, but it was enough to make James lean forward, heart pounding. "Shadow?" he whispered softly. Shadow's ear flicked. A second later, his eyelids fluttered open, revealing a sliver of those familiar golden eyes. They were unfocused, hazy, but alive. James's breath left him in a trembling rush. Hey, boy, I'm here." The monitor's beeping changed, faster, steadier. Shadow's head shifted toward the sound of James's voice. His gaze struggled to focus, searching the air as though trying to follow a memory he wasn't sure was real. "It's me," James whispered again, leaning closer. "It's your partner, your family. I'm right here." This time, Shadow's breathing stuttered, and a faint whine escaped. Him. Raw, broken, but unmistakably emotional. A nurse walking by stopped in the doorway, eyes widening. "Doctor, you need to see this." The veterinarian hurried into the room. Her expression softened instantly. This is incredible." "What's happening?" David asked. The vet stepped closer to the table, watching Shadow carefully. "He's responding to your voice," she said quietly. "His heart rate just stabilized. His oxygen levels are improving. He was completely unresponsive last night." James touched Shadow's cheek with trembling fingers. "You hear me, don't you? You came back because of me, and I'm not leaving." Shadow nudged into his hand, weak, shaky, but deliberate. Tears spilled down James's face as he stroked the dog's muzzle. "He recognizes you," the vet confirmed, her voice thick with emotion. "This kind of response, it's rare. Animals in his condition usually don't react at all, but he's fighting." James bowed, his forehead resting gently against Shadow's. "You're a warrior," he whispered. "You always were." Shadow let out a soft huff of breath as if agreeing. The vet placed a reassuring hand on James's shoulder. "This may be the turning point. He's not out of danger yet, but he has a reason to keep fighting now." James's tears fell freely. "I'll give him 1,000 reasons." For the first time in a year, hope didn't hurt. It felt real, alive. Shadow had survived the fire. He had survived the streets. And now, because he heard the voice he trusted most, he had chosen to survive again. News of Shadow's survival spread through the department faster than anyone expected. By noon, officers who once served alongside James were filing into the clinic lobby, some in disbelief, others in quiet awe. Shadow had been more than a K-9 partner. He had been a hero, a legend. And legends weren't supposed to return from the dead. The police chief himself arrived, his uniform damp from the lingering rain. He paused at the doorway of Shadow's room, staring through the small window. When he finally entered, his usually commanding voice softened. "James, I heard the rumors. I had to see it myself." James looked up from the bedside. "It's true. He's alive." The chief exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "My God." "Shadow." Shadow stirred slightly at the sound of voices but didn't open his eyes. His body was still weak, fighting for strength hour by hour. "You all wrote him off," James said quietly, his voice tight with emotion. "You held a memorial. You filed him as deceased." The chief's expression changed. Guilt flickered in his eyes. He stepped closer, choosing his words with care. "James, there's something you don't know." James's jaw tensed. "What?" The chief hesitated. "After the explosion, we found signs that Shadow might have escaped. There were prints leading out of the wreckage, bloody, but moving. We searched for days, but the area was unstable, collapsing. They ordered us to pull out. James stared at him in disbelief. You knew he might have survived, and you didn't tell me? It wasn't confirmed, the chief insisted, and you were in critical condition. We didn't want to give you false hope. False hope? James's voice cracked. Hope is better than living with guilt. The room fell silent. David stepped forward, his voice low but firm. He deserved to know. Shadow wasn't just a dog, he was family. The chief lowered his head. You're right, and I'm sorry. James turned toward Shadow again, his anger dissolving into sorrow. He survived alone, he whispered. He wandered for months, injured, starving, looking for me. The chief swallowed hard. A dog doesn't travel that far unless it's trying to return home. Shadow's ear twitched as if acknowledging the truth being spoken around. Him. James reached for Shadow's paw, gently wrapping his fingers around it. You never gave up on me, he murmured. Not once. The chief placed a hand on James's shoulder. We'll support whatever you need. Medical bills, therapy, long-term care. Shadow earned that and more. James nodded, eyes full of quiet determination. All I need, he said softly, is for him to keep fighting. And in the soft beep of the monitor, in the faint flutter of Shadow's breathing, James felt it. He wasn't fighting alone. The days that followed felt like living inside a fragile dream, one that James refused to let slip away. Shadow remained in the clinic, receiving round-the-clock care. Every morning the vet delivered updates. Every hour James stayed by Shadow's side, refusing to miss a single moment of his recovery. Shadow's progress was painfully slow at first. Tiny breaths, small twitches, a barely there lift of his head. But every small sign felt like a miracle. James spent hours talking to him, quiet conversations about old missions, about the empty apartment waiting to be filled again, about all the nights he had cried thinking Shadow was gone forever. Shadow listened in silence, his eyes half closed as if trying to absorb each word like medicine. One afternoon, as James gently stroked his muzzle, Shadow nudged his nose forward just an inch. But it was deliberate. It was him saying, I'm here. I hear you. James gasped softly. Good boy. That's my Shadow. David entered with fresh clothes and food. He smiled when he saw Shadow move. He's getting stronger, David said. Slow, but steady. The vet agreed. He's responding well to treatment. His organs are stabilizing. And his emotional improvement is remarkable. Dogs don't usually recover this quickly unless they have a strong reason to fight. James looked at Shadow, emotion tightening his chest. He has a reason. Every day, Shadow pushed. Himself a little more. He lifted his head longer. He drank water without assistance. He even managed a weak tail wag when James arrived one morning. That simple wag nearly brought James to tears. One evening, after nearly 3 weeks, the vet approached James with a smile. He's ready to try standing. James's breath caught. Are you sure? With your help, she replied. They supported Shadow gently, lifting him from the bed. His legs trembled violently. His paws slipped. But then, slowly, he steadied himself, leaning against James's wheelchair. James placed a hand over Shadow's heart, feeling the faint but steady rhythm beneath his palm. You're doing it, he whispered, one step at a time. Just like before. Shadow looked up at him, eyes brighter, clearer, filled with the same determination that once made him the strongest K9 in the unit. He took a shaky step, then another. David exhaled in awe. He's coming back. A tear slipped down James's cheek. He never left, he murmured. His body broke, but his spirit stayed alive. Shadow pressed his head gently against James's knee, an old gesture of loyalty, of love, of I'm still yours." And for the first time in a year, James felt whole again. 2 months later, when Shadow was finally strong enough to walk short distances, James made a decision. A difficult one. A necessary one. He wheeled himself toward Shadow, who was resting on a padded mat near the window. The dog lifted his head immediately, ears perking at the familiar sound of James's chair approaching. "Come on, boy," James said softly. "We're going somewhere important today." Shadow stood slowly, his movements careful but determined. His once weak legs were sturdier now. His coat had regained a bit of its shine. His eyes, those golden eyes, were full of trust. David drove them to the outskirts of the industrial district, the place James hadn't visited since that fateful night. The closer they got, the tighter his chest grew. He felt Shadow shift uneasily in the back seat, sensing the change in energy. When they arrived, the warehouse stood like a ghost. Blackened walls, half-collapsed roof, twisted metal scattered like bones. Nature had begun reclaiming it. Weeds grew through cracks, rainwater filled deep potholes, and silence hung heavy in the air. Shadow stepped out of the car, sniffing the wind. His tail lowered, but he didn't cower. He walked slowly to James's side as if reminding him, "We face this together." James rolled forward until they reached the center of the ruin, the place he last saw. Shadow disappear in the smoke. His hands tightened on the armrests. Memories crashed over him, the explosion, the screams, the desperate bark that had haunted him for a year. Shadow approached the charred ground, sniffed gently, then looked back at James with soft, understanding eyes. "You saved me here," James whispered, "and I couldn't save you." Shadow stepped closer, leaning his head into James's lap. The gesture was quiet but powerful. "You did your best. I survived because of you." David stood back, giving them space. James reached down, stroking Shadow's neck. "I spent months blaming myself, thinking I abandoned you, thinking you died alone. But you didn't. You fought. You fought harder than anyone ever could." Shadow placed his paw on James's knee. Steady, strong, certain. The same gesture he made the night he first recognized him at the bus stop. James's voice broke. "Thank you for coming back to me." A breeze swept through the ruins, carrying away the dust, the smoke, the ghosts. For the first time, the warehouse no longer felt like a grave. It felt like a chapter finally closing. James inhaled deeply, letting the past settle. "Let's go home," he whispered. Shadow barked softly, his first real bark since the night they reunited. Not a cry of pain, not a plea, but a promise. Weeks passed after visiting the warehouse ruins, and Shadow's recovery accelerated in ways the veterinarians hadn't predicted. His appetite returned. His coat grew thicker. His steps became stronger. Still careful, still slow, but full of the determination that had carried him through a year of suffering just to find James again. One bright afternoon, James rolled his wheelchair onto a quiet park trail, Shadow trotting faithfully at his side. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting warm, dappled patterns across the path. The air smelled of grass and spring. Fresh, alive, peaceful. It was the kind of day James once believed he would never experience again. Shadow stopped occasionally to sniff flowers, watch children run, or simply feel the breeze. Every time he looked back at James, his tail gave a soft, confident wag, as if checking, "You're still with me?" James always smiled back. Always. They reached a small wooden bench overlooking a pond. Ducks glided across the water. Leaves rustled softly overhead. James parked the wheelchair beside the bench, and Shadow lay down beside him, resting his head gently on James's knee. James stroked his fur thoughtfully. "You know," he murmured, "I spent months thinking you were gone forever. I thought the explosion took everything from me." Shadow sighed, a warm, content sound. "But I was wrong," James continued. "You weren't gone. You were fighting your way back to me." Shadow lifted his head, eyes shining with quiet affection. He nudged James's hand, urging him to keep talking. James laughed softly. "I guess you always were the stubborn one." For a long moment they simply watched the water together. No pain, no fear, no ghosts between them. Just companionship. A bond reforged through fire, loss, and impossible survival. David approached from the trail carrying 2 coffees. "Thought I'd find you here," he said with a smile. "Shadow's looking good." James nodded. "He's stronger every day." David kneeled to pet Shadow. "You brought him back, you know. Gave him something to fight for." James shook his head. "No, he brought himself back. He crossed miles, lived through hell, all because he believed I was still waiting." Shadow's tail thumped proudly. James leaned closer, wrapping an arm around Shadow's neck. "I won't lose you again," he whispered. "Not now. Not ever." Shadow responded with a gentle lick to James's hand. Soft, grateful, full of love. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in warm golds and pinks. As the light shimmered on the water, James felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace, hope, a future. Shadow stood proudly beside him, strong again, loyal as ever. A new chapter had begun, one they would walk together, side by